140-year thing was a victim of my too fast typing, but it sometimes feels like 140 years. When Mike first volunteered me to make this presentation, I thought, oh, this would be easy because I made it in 1995 and I'd just get my slides out and scan them and I wouldn't have to do any work. About 6 weeks ago, I realized I hadn't seen those slides for a while, and 2 weeks later, I still hadn't seen those slides, so this is an entirely new presentation using a lot of the same resources, but 20 years of more information and more insight. So without further ado, let's get started. There's a lot of word slides here because I found out making these presentations to people my own age, they don't hear very well sometimes. So those of you who are way in the back might want to move forward so you can read my word slides. Where we go here? Okay. Normally when you talk about train operations, you hear about trains, but to understand train operations, you have to understand the environment that the train ran in and what it was trying to accomplish for its customers and the resources it had to do that. So we're going to spend the first half of this presentation talking about that. Obviously, everybody knows that I.E. James had to design a railroad that went from one Bank of California property to another, but he had to get there a very circuitous way, and he had to serve customers that were already there in very crowded urban situations in Virginia City and Gold Hill. All of that created very strange operating requirements. So we're going to talk about that, as well as how they got the customers going and how they got the freight going, and then why they eventually went to timetable operations.
Left, right side.
What happens if I press the red button?
It's a laser.
Okay. The right side?
Oh, sorry.
It's one of those operational constraints.
Okay. All right.
There we go.
So the nice thing about researching the early years is there's not much factual information, so you can make up a lot of stuff. Hopefully, what you find out is there's a bunch of unrelated information that you think is unrelated, but when you think about it, you actually can put pieces together, and that's what I hope I've done, with a modicum of imagination and maybe just a little bit of fantasy. Okay. The interesting thing about the early operations was that in order to get to many of the mines and many of the mills, you couldn't get there. And you had to load stuff or unload stuff from the main line. And that was one of the major problems they had in the early years. All of the stuff that they were going to try to serve, all the customers were already there. The mills were already there, they were already constructed, the mines were already there. And the railroad had to thread its way in and out of all of this stuff and figure out how to get there in a most economical fashion. So I've listed here what the customers really looked like. Most people don't realize it, but the biggest revenue product was wood, not ore. The mines consumed huge amounts of wood, the mills did as well, and sometimes didn't produce any ore. So the real moneymaker in terms of dollars to the railroad and traffic was wood cars. And I've listed here where early on the major sources of wood were. A lot of the wood, even through the early 1870s and early 1880s, came down the Carson River and was pulled out of the river at any flat spot where the river would slow down enough to do it. So the Carson River wood yards were again a major customer. Oops, excuse me. The railroad, being owned by bankers, did not anticipate spending a lot of money. So when they started out, the idea was they were going to haul freight. And because they had a franchise with the state, they had to provide passenger service. But in the early years where they were just running from Carson to Virginia, that passenger service was just local. No express trains, nothing, just a little caboose hung on the end of a freight train. They only bought 5 locomotives. They only bought 25 ore cars of 8-ton capacity. That means 200 tons a day if they used each car one a day. Some of the mines were producing more than that. So those cars had to go back and forth several times a day if they were gonna haul the ore. The 17 wood dumps, that was another 170 tons. They only went to certain mills, but basically they didn't have enough capacity in their rolling stock to handle the traffic in the first months. And they started to fix that problem, but it took a while. We don't know exactly how many flat cars were there on opening day. By July of 1870, they had 35 or so, but clearly they didn't have enough rolling stock to do what they needed to do. The two combination cars came along early, and they were the only passenger service for the first 6 months or so. They additionally had two cabooses that showed up on the roster. We don't know when those were built. They eventually got mentioned in the newspapers. They were sometimes used very early on in the early passenger trains before anybody else was up to haul bullion. That's our little fantasy. Okay, you all know what the locomotives were, so I won't spend much time on that. Two Baldwin locomotives that were basically the mainline locomotives. The Story was the backup mainline locomotive and the one that handled extras. And then the Lion and the Ormsby did whatever else was necessary. And you'll see sometimes that was everything. The ore cars had specific customers that they targeted. The bottom dump ore cars could go to mills that had the receiving facilities high enough in the air that you could bottom dump. The side dumps went to mills that already existed where you couldn't deliver stuff that way. And the side dumps were also used to haul tailings from down at the Mexican mill all the way back up to Virginia City, where they went to the tailings mill in 6 Mile Canyon. Flat cars handled cordwood, finished lumber, and rough timbers, and the combination cars were there for people, mainly people who were going back and forth between Carson and Virginia. But, you know, occasionally people like women who lived at the Brunswick mill would go to Carson on shopping trips. There were a lot of interesting newspaper articles about baggage being misappropriated and chasing down a lady who picked up the wrong basket. Okay. You can see the list here of the mills that were, the wood yards that existed. The ones that have asterisks on them were the railroad-owned wood yards. The others were storage wood yards. You can see the water tanks. The one at Santiago Mine was really very close to Silver Switch, but water was always a problem. Sometimes there wasn't any water. There are a few telegraph messages about that I'll tell you later. But basically you had to feed and water your animals, and they tried to do that as best they could with limited resources. They had 3 turntables during this time period. We do not know when the one at Silver Switch was put in, but it was put in fairly early. Passing sidings, I'm not sure when the one at Empire was put in. Life was difficult without it. But basically these were the locations where you could run an engine around a train, or you could pass trains without backing into and out of a siding. The problem that they had in Gold Hill was that there wasn't any land available. In fact, the North Yellow Jacket hoist works had to be moved back in order to get the railroad to fit in. But all of the hoisting works were there, the ore dumps were there. Some of the mills were located in locations where the railroad simply couldn't get there, and interesting delivery systems were put together. Had the same problem with wood dumps, and you'll see some of those. And some of the mills, wood had to be delivered from the main line as well. So the railroad had to cope with all of these things, leaving cars sitting on the main line for unloading or loading, and when other trains were going to come by without telephones or sometimes without telegraph communication. It was a real challenge to be a train crew, considering that they worked about 12 hours a day, 7 days a week. Early on, as they approached Gold Hill, the Belcher area only had a trestle, a single track trestle with a mine located. There actually were 3 mines located there, the Old Overman, the Segregated Belcher, and the Belcher. During the period we're going to talk about, the Belcher wasn't producing much in the way of ore, but it was consuming a lot of wood. So anything that got picked up or delivered to these three mines happened on the main line. Cars were left there, and the standard way of getting a car down to that area was to roll it by gravity down from the Gold Hill Yard. This railroad was designed with gravity as the sixth locomotive. Let me get out my little pointer here. This picture was taken in 1876, so it's way beyond what we talked about, but you can see here was the trestle that went in front of the railroad. This is a fence. This is not a feature we want to know about. But they had to double track this eventually because there were too many wood cars sitting on the main line. You can see here where the Belcher mine stored its timbers, and here's where it stored the cordwood. The big fence was here to keep the kids from stealing cordwood for their parents' houses. That was a major economic problem for the railroads. But you can see, we go up here today, of course, everything looks flat, but this was a really steep hillside back in the 1870s, as was much of the area. Here is the segregated Belcher hoist works. It was still producing at this period of time. Here's their waste dump. The original Overman was over here, and its waste dump was here. And in getting the low line through here, the lower Gold Hill branch, they actually had to tunnel through the waste dumps. This picture, I think, was taken on July 12th because the newspaper in Gold Hill on July 5th had a wonderful story about the 4th of July celebration, followed by the fire that burned the town down. On the 12th of July, the Gold Hill Daily News said that their local photographer, Mr. A.J. Beals, was taking a picture of the fire damage. So I think that this indicates about when that picture was taken. But you can see here that we're basically going through a fully built up town in that era, and the railroad had to take what was available. Early on, this is how wood got down to the Crown Point mine. You put a wood car here, and the guys would stand up there and throw the wood into the flume, and down it would go with a big crash. That's how they were delivering firewood, of course, not finished timbers. The Yellow Jacket wood yard was over here, where I do not have a date for when they put the siding in there, but obviously they unloaded a lot of wood very early. But again, a situation where you were unloading loaded cars by hand from cars located on the main line. Later on, this is an 1876 picture, when the Crown Point was consuming huge amounts of wood. They had to increase the size of that wood dump, and you can see they could have unloaded 3 cars up here at the same time. Here's a remnant of that early chute. Here's the same location from the side. You can see they sat the cars up here and threw it down into that chute, and all of the wood accumulated down here, and then eventually got taken over to the powerhouse across this little dealio. That was an elevator if they needed wood down on the lower level. But you can see everything's crammed in there, and the railroad had to fit its way through this as best it could. Here's a map I made in 1991. Here's the Yellow Jacket South Shaft. That was the one that produced mainly after the railroad was built. The North Shaft up here was the big producer during the 1860s. It was full of low-grade ore. What they did in those days, there was no room for low-grade ore to be stacked out here. They would mine, take the high-grade ore out, and the low-grade ore they put back in the stopes to hold them up so they wouldn't collapse. That created a problem when they took it out to put it on the railroad, because then the ground started to subside in here. But you can see the North Yellow Jacket dump was right here at the beginning of the curve. The Confidence Mine dump was here. The Challenge was back over here, but they really weren't much of a producer. I've drawn in this water tank because there was some kind of a structure there, and the newspaper has referred to the railroad's Gold Hill water tank. That wasn't in Stevens' list, and I don't know when that arrived and when it disappeared, but it's in a number of the pictures. So we have to assume it was there for some period of time. This is 1876, 1877, but it's the only picture we have of the Confidence mine dump right here. It's a single spout little deal, and the mine's way back here. Here is the North Yellow Jacket ore dump with the mine behind it. This building was actually out here, and it had to be taken apart and moved back up the hill to make room for the railroad to thread its way through here. Prior to 1872, when they built this depot, this was a big hill. This just went down, 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 down here. And all of the area that you see now was fill. So the railroad basically crawled along the edge of a hill, cut into the hillside. There is the Crown Point, the South Yellow Jacket wood dump. And this thing, is that it? Yeah, here is what's supposed to be perhaps a water tank.
Charlie,
Yes.
quick question. Year again on that photo?
This is 1876, 1877. It's a Watkins photo that's been blowing up. Okay, we're back here because I want to now focus on this end of the picture here. You see there's the North Yellow Jacket ore dump and a train. Let's blow that up. I'm sorry this is blurry, but this was a huge panorama which is blowing up. You have 9 ore cars here. Those are the original built ore cars with 33-inch wheels. That's the second photograph we have of the first 25 ore cars. Notice here you have a locomotive hauling a very sharp flat car. Look at that tender, the flare on that tender. Look at the flare on the Armsby's tender. I think that's the only photograph we have of either the Lion or the Armsby running on the V&T. I'll take you back so you can look at it again. Let's look at the size of that big stack and that little bitty tender with the flare. I don't think there's any other V&T locomotive that had those features. So I've been looking at this photograph for about 20 years. This is the first time I blew it up to this size, and wonderful things you find out when you blow things up on the computer. Okay, facilities in Gold Hill were very rudimentary. This is the big turn across to this highway. This is the only depot that existed there prior to 1872. Just one little platform for people to get on and off the train. Remember, there was no merchandise being hauled on the railroad. There was no connection. Maybe some of the merchants in Carson City would ship little things up and maybe unload it here. Notice the train, if the caboose was on the end of the train, then the train would stop on the grade crossing, block all the traffic. You'd have huge ore wagons coming down the hill to get to the mills, having to contend with the fact that there might be a train parked on the road. So they built another platform over here in 1871 so that the train could stop over here and they wouldn't impede the grade crossing. But between the railroad and the mud and the wagons, that grade crossing got rebuilt about every 3 months. Okay, basically from day one, they started revenue operations. They were bankers, they wanted money. And so I've just put down here a list of dates that kind of give you an idea of the evolution of freight service in Gold Hill. Starting, sorry, wrong button. Starting with this is the first call from the North Yellow Jacket. Later on in that same year, the Confidence began shipping ore. The Caledonia was shipping ore in January. In February 4th, they began building the lower Gold Hill branch to get to the Crown Point. By March 26th, the segregated Belcher had not built an ore dump yet, and they were loading ore by wheelbarrows and shovels. By April, the lower Gold Hill branch was in, and the Crown Point was building a big ore dump, and that was finished in May. And the big deal was that they could load 12 ore cars in 15 minutes. Lots of ore was stored up waiting for the railroad to get there. So From the time the tracks got there, they started to haul revenue cars, and as they moved that track around through Gold Hill, they continued to pick up more and more customers. Here's the track diagram for the lower Gold Hill branch, starting here near the Baltic Switch, going through the old Overman dump, the segregated Belcher dump, down around the bend here, off to the mines. That was like, well, it was a very heavy grade. I don't remember the exact number. Just so you know that wasn't fantasy, this is a V&T map from October 1907. They were doing a survey of where all the mine waste dumps were because they thought they could haul that off to be processed. So you can see the segregated Belcher dump was in fact here. The Belcher mine was back here, and the Belcher dump was here. You can see the amounts. They had 3,000 tons of segregated Belcher waste and 100,000 tons of Belcher waste, all of which they thought was probably low-grade ore that could be handled by cyanide process. And the reason that it's no longer there. Okay, I've always wondered how they got loaded ore cars out of the Crown Point, out of the lower Gold Hill grade, and empty ones down there. And the newspaper is full of accounts of locomotives pulling trains up that grade with both loaded and empty ore cars. And the answer obviously is that a train that got down to this point and had to pick up cars from the Crown Point via the branch would have to leave all of the cars it was taking down up there on the main line, except for the empty lower cars, and then back down, pick up the loads and pull the empties and the loads back up to the main line, leave the loads there, and then back down again with the empties. That's the only way they could do that because there was no passing track anywhere near this location. During the middle of the 1870s, when some of the larger locomotives arrived, there were contests between train crews as to how many cars they could pull up and down that grade, and the newspaper would gleefully report which conductor was, which engineer was leading the haul competition at the time. But as I said, very, very different operations, because when you think about construction, and I think I've got a slide on this later, but when they built this railroad, they were running trains from Carson up the hill to the end of track. And there were no turntables anywhere. Consequently, during construction, these trains ran backwards as much as they ran forwards. And in fact, until they got to Virginia City and built the turntable, even the revenue trains that left Gold Hill had to go backwards one direction. So here you had two 6.0s with no trailing truck to avoid flange wear, backing down the V&T's myriad curves. And I just wonder if that wasn't one of the early problems with the Lion and the Armsby and the Story, just having driver wear backing up and down the entire main line and doing the switching, of course. This is again another 1876 picture, but you know, this is a typical down train, a bunch of empty flat cars going back down to the wood yards, and some loaded ore cars ready to haul down. And if this happened to be one of the so-called passenger trains, there would be either Combine 1 or Combine 2 on the back end. Well, here is the lower Gold Hill track looking down to the mine dumps, the ore dumps. The track on the right is not a railroad track. That is how the waste got hauled out of both the South Yellow Jacket, the Kentuck, and the Crown Point. All the mine waste that accumulated over the years came out on a little tramway pulled by a horse. So you can imagine that horse or a series of horses work 24 hours a day, 7 days a week to accommodate that. The lower Gold Hill branch was called euphemistically Old Slippery, which tells you that probably the locomotive drivers slipped a lot, hauling these huge amounts of ore up that hill. Here's a little bit closer view of what was down there. All of this was built after the railroad for the most part. Here is the mine waste dump. Here is the bridge for the tramway to get across the ravine. Water was still coming down here, and the ore dumps were over here on this side. Must have been a lovely place to work, considering the noise that was going on, and the locomotive whistles and all the other industrial noise that you had to live with in Gold Hill. Okay, we've gotten through Gold Hill, and we're on our way to Virginia City now. And you can see the dates, how long it took them actually to get service into Virginia City. By November 20th, they did reach the car shop where the locomotives Virginia and Carson had been erected. And so by November 20th, those locomotives were now available. Took them till January 5th to get to the Collar Potosi, which was the first mine in southern Virginia. It took them almost another 3 weeks to get to the next mine, and it took them till January 29th to get a passenger train to the Virginia City depot location. And about that same time, these two mines began shipping ore. And about 2 months later, the Golden Curry, which is the mine right next to the old depot, began to load ore as well. So it took them quite a while, actually, to get revenue trains out of Virginia City, simply because they didn't get there. Another Charlie Siebenthal map. Here was the spur going to the Collar Potosi, the switchback spur going to the Hale and Norcross dump. All of these were downhill. This was downhill. This was downhill. North of here, there was no passing track. So a train that went up to the depot, or any train that came up in this direction and wanted to load cars to the Hale or Norcross or the Collar Potosi, either had to let them come down by gravity or do a flying switch. We know they did flying switches because there was a report about an unfortunate lady who was walking to work on the railroad tracks, and she saw the locomotives go by, but she didn't know the cars were coming down, and they killed her. There's another story in the newspaper about a guy sitting in his wagon waiting for the locomotive to go by, and it did, and he started up his wagon, and he didn't see those cars either, and he lost the rear end of his wagon. So gravity operations and flying switches were just a standard way of life on the railroad every day in this location. And it was designed to do that, simply because they didn't have a passing track. Here's the Collar Potosi dump in 1876. At this point in time, they were loading ore in the ore wagons with what they call the back action. Nevada seems to like multiple wagon freight vehicles. I think there's 5 or 6 pairs of horses, or mules I should say, pulling these. You can see the V&T cars sitting on the spur back here, and you can see that there indeed was quite a grade down this spur. This is the passing track was put in this location, and we don't really know, I don't know when that passing track was actually put in, but operations without it would have been really difficult. Here's the Hale and Norcross, and you can see the main line here. Here's the spur going to the Collar Potosi, and there's the switch going off to the Hale and Norcross dump. Again, they had to work with what they had in the way of space and service the buildings that were already there. So here's what that looked like schematically. You had the depot up in here at the Collar Potosi, and anything that was going to go into the Savage mine either have to be backed in or it had to go in by gravity. You would have to go back in here and by gravity back down to here, and then the locomotives could push it in. This is the passing siding that eventually got put in and solved a lot of the operating problems, but it definitely wasn't there early on. So really, Mr. James was quite a genius in designing a railroad that could use something it couldn't avoid, which was hillsides and gravity. This is the Hale and Norcross from the other side. There's the ore car loading track. This kind of a curve was always a problem, of course, with gravity operations, because people trying to cross this road crossing here couldn't see the train coming. In the early years, there was no instruction that the engineer was supposed to blow his horn or ring his bell. They eventually did that in the middle of 1870 when the timetable came out. But remember, these guys were trying to figure out how to run a railroad in these early years. This was 1869 when this got started. There's a Savage mine, and you can see the ore dump in a state of dilapidation. It's got splay braces on it now. But here are, I think there were 13 of the iron ore dumps loaded here. I think that retaining wall used to be there. I'm not sure it still is. But the ore dump sat on that retaining wall and overhung it, and that's why it was beginning to lean. Quite an operation at the Savage. Took out a lot of dirt and a lot of ore. So here is what happened when they finally got to the north end. The main line was completed in January 29th, 1870. They did not begin building that depot until August 15th of 1870. So obviously serving passengers in comfort was not a main idea of this railroad. There must have been a platform in here for the passengers to get on and off the train. Here's where the Golden Curry ore dump was. That by the same time, August 15th, they were doubling in size because they were sending out a lot of ore. I think that this track was probably original as well because they delivered a lot of wood to this location that was later transferred to the mines by wagon. So it took them from late December 1870 in Gold Hill, the first passenger train, to January 21st. To January 29th before they could haul any passengers out of Virginia City, and until August, until they began passenger service from the depot. So what that means is that depot really didn't serve the railroad for more than about 15 or 16 months, because obviously when they went through the East Street Tunnel and built a new depot in Virginia, they abandoned that as a depot. This is again 1876. Here's the depot. Here's the main line. Here's the Golden Curry Hoist Works, and here's their ore dump, right next to the passenger terminal. Here's the yard. Here's the track with the boxcar on it, and then the wood yard is right next to it. I believe this is a fence here, or a retaining wall, but it could also be wood. But you can see all of this, or at least most of this, the old mine, the ore dump, and a lot of the housing was already there when the railroad was built. So it really threaded its way through the world. This was a problem, of course. They were loading wood off the main line here for this mine, and the Collar Potosi, or they were unloading it here and hauling it by wagon. And by 1871, and I'm stepping over my timeline here, there were so many trains on the main line that they couldn't leave cars sitting here anymore. And so they put this track in to provide wood deliveries to the Savage and the Hale and Norcross, and then later on they extended it to the Collar Potosi. Again, just to get cars off the main line and let trains go by. Here's the track to the Savage. You can see the grade of this line. Here's, look at the height difference here and the height difference here. So they would have to sit loaded wood cars here, tie down the brakes, and hope that they stayed. Here you can see the track going up to the Collar Potosi, and the branch here going over to the Hale and Norcross. Some years ago we walked that. I don't know if you can still do that today, but 20 years ago it was still there very obviously. Whoops, excuse me. Here's again the Hale and Norcross mine and the ore dump. You can see that wood delivery track up here. Here's two short flats loaded with cordwood, a long flat with cordwood, and then another flat here with what looks like stacks of timbers on it. Here's a cordwood yard. Here's some marvelous device to get wood down from here to here. You can see the timbers stacked up here. So this had to be some kind of a lower vader, as they called it, to get the timbers down to the storage area. Power plant was over here, and that's where the cordwood was usually. Here's the back view of that. Here's the V&T track running along the base of this fence. The cordwood stacks, I think this was cordwood as delivered in 8-foot or 4-foot sections. They cut it up into smaller sections here. You can see by the size of these people that was a tall fence. That's because this little girl's brother would be sent by the mother here to go steal wood at night. Major problem. And one of the main reasons that they hired watchmen for both yards was to keep people from stealing the wood. Of course, the railroad could have solved that problem by lowering the price on wood, but that never occurred to them. Okay, here's the collar of Potosi. You can look at this stuff, interesting stuff, for a few seconds while I talk. Here's the ore dump. You can see the mine was way up here. Ore came out of the shaft down here through a tunnel, which went to the ore dump. You can see their wood yard up here, and the end of that spur for the wood delivery spur was up here. So you can see it was quite a climb to get up to there, even though this foreshortens it a bit. Here's the end of that track going to the collar of Potosi. Here you can see their timbers are stored here, cordwood's back over here, more wood, and there's an empty flat car sitting here at the end of the line. So all this was done mainly to get wood to a customer, not to get ore. Okay, when I talked to Stephen, he asked me what I was going to use as the first revenue train, and there is a nice newspaper article that says the first intentional revenue train was from the North Yellow Jacket to the Yellow Jacket Mill on November 19th. But if you go and read the newspaper article for the first train into Gold Hill, it says the Lion came in pulling 4 cars of exuberant railroad officials, but behind it was the Armsby hauling a flat car loaded with wood for the Crown Point. I don't think they did that for free, not with these guys in charge. So you can pick whichever one you like, but I'm going to stick with November 13th. Here's my deduction about the lack of a turntable until November 20th, which is when they got to Virginia City. And we don't know that's when they built the Virginia City turntable, but that's when the newspaper said that the roundhouse was almost finished. All during construction, and all the revenue trains prior to that date had to go down backwards, or either up backwards or down backwards. You would think that they probably went up with the locomotives running forward, but one doesn't know. They did their own thing, and as best they could. But it never occurred to me that this had to be true, that during this time period, they were running the whole length of the railroad backwards, either with empty cars or with loaded cars. And then after they started to haul loaded ore cars, they were hauling loads backwards down the hill as well. Okay, here's again some idea of when they finally began to haul ore from the different mines and to the different mills. You can see again there was a gradual evolution of revenue trains. You can see until March 5th of 1870, the Silver City branch was not there. I'm going to talk about that at the end of this presentation, simply because I put it there in case I ran out of time. But again, they began to lose customers in 1870 as well. In the late fall and early winter of 1870, there was no water in the Carson River. Most of the mills were running at half capacity or less. In July, the ore dump for the Eureka Mill burned down and they lost that customer. So toward the end of 1870, business kind of slowed down, and in fact they put 2 engines into storage for the next couple of months until the rain got started again. Here is the problem they had with the Vivian Mill, which is located way over here, down the river. Here was their dump to get stuff down to that level. Both wood and ore came down at this location, loaded onto a little tram car, and taken all the way down here to the mill. This is the Vivian cut, which I will talk about later. You can see that any train coming in this direction could not see a train coming in the other direction. A major problem. This structure here, I've concluded, is kind of a funnel for wood. I think that they threw cordwood into this thing, and by the time it got to the other end, it was straight and running down the hill here. This also happened at the Santiago, which we'll look at in a minute. There is a newspaper article about a train running into a wood car here at the Santiago. That wood car would have been left here on the main line, and after the train hit it, it wound up down here. You have to wonder how many times that happened. This picture again was taken in 1876, and by this time the railroad had actually built a little trestle passing siding with the ore dump on it so they could leave cars here for the Santiago that were not on the main line. This was the cordwood dump, and this was the tramway that went down to the ore dump. They early learned that if you let ore slide down a chute at that angle, that it would destroy what was ever at the bottom to receive it. And here you can see that by 1876, they had abandoned the dump down here, put in a trackage, and there's a little car that carried the ore down. You can see the cordwood dump here, and the pile that somebody made out of the cordwood after it was safe to work down here. But you can imagine how much fun it must have been down here, watching the wood slide down and wondering if you were far enough behind the pile to stay alive. Okay, by design, all of the spurs to the mills was connected so that loaded trains could come down and back into the mill. Always curious how the unloaded cars got out of the mill. Well, what happened was, I have a set of testimony for a lawsuit. One of the brakemen got injured, and there's lots of depositions about how they ran the trains here. Trains going up the hill that had to pick up ore cars, empty ore cars, would drop their train at the switch. Conductor would get off. The head brakeman would get off, throw the switch, climb onto the pilot bar, the pilot deck of the locomotive. The locomotive would go up the mine spur, and when they got near the ore cars, he would lift up the drawbar and guide it into the drawhead of the first ore car. Then he would walk across the drawbar and drop the pin in. Then he would climb across each car and release the brakes. And then they would back the car out, back the train of cars out of empties, pick up their train, and push the empty cars all the way to Bound House, which was the first passing siding available. So this train would be going up the hill with wood loads behind it and empty ore cars in front of it, with the head brakeman in the first ore car watching out for somebody else. Well, that first brakeman got into that first ore car, without checking whether the car, these were side dumps, without checking whether the car side dump locking mechanism was locked. And it tipped and threw him out, fractured his skull. So he sued the railroad, and we have these wonderful depositions by the conductor, by the engineer, and by him, which is where all this information came from. By the way, the judge decided that this guy was dumb not to check the lock on the car, and it wasn't the railroad's fault. An amazing conclusion. In fact, all of these lawsuits worked out that way. Here's the car that caused his problem. You can't hardly see it, but here is the pin that locks it from dumping. And to dump it, they had to knock that down and then release the tipping mechanism. The other thing that they said, that all the ore cars at the mills were unloaded by mill employees. It was not the railroad's responsibility to dump these cars or even to move them. The cars would get pushed into the mill and dropped over the receiving facilities by gravity, one at a time, and all that was done by the mill hands, not the railroad. They brought it in and they took it out, but once they got it there, it was your problem. You can see even with the iron dumps, these cars were set up to go downhill with loads, and the brakemen were always standing on top of the cars, on top of the oar, jumping from car to car, keeping the trains from going down the hill too fast. Going up the hill, the car brakes weren't needed, obviously, so they didn't need to operate them fully. Consequently, they weren't standing there on that 3-inch angle iron trying to balance. Here's the famous picture from the Morgan Mill, and it obviously was staged, but you can see there's a string of empties down here. There's one car that they were bringing down to join it, and this was a downgrade, designed as a downgrade so that you could drop the cars by gravity. So you can see by 1876, this track was not in the greatest condition. But again, designed to make gravity a useful extra locomotive. The only east-connected spur early on was the Mexican Mill, and why they did that is beyond me, but again, I can guess. The Mexican Mill had a lot of tailings, and eventually they hauled those tailings out by rail, so that there could be a requirement to just haul loaded ore cars out of the Mexican Mill tailings yard. But the only way, I do not know when they put the passing track into Empire, but without it, the only way they could have gotten in is a flying switch. You can see here the trackage at Mexican. Here's the passing siding, and I don't know when that got in, as I said. The railroad was downgrade here, downgrade from Carson. So it was going to be easy for them to drop off the loaded ore cars here, have the engine run ahead, conductor drop off to throw the switch, and the ore cars could then, by gravity, come in here, and the locomotive could come back and push them into the mill. Without that passing siding, there was no other way to operate. And eventually, huge wood yard down here, and a lot of wood stored along in here. And a lot of wood was hauled out of here, which you'll see later. Okay, the railroad was built with wood from Harrington's flumes that came down Ash Canyon and Kings Canyon. The second source of wood was stockpiles along the Carson River, which was often at mill sites. And the third source later on, of course, was the Clear Creek flume, which began operating in September of 1870, and the V&T branch down there was in service by October of 1870. And about that time, they realized they needed more flat cars. Okay, let's talk about passenger service. In this date, the first combine appeared on the track. 2 days later, they took an officer's excursion down to Carson City from the Yellow Jacket dump. Early December, they had a public excursion to Carson City that left from the Virginia workshop. December 14th, the officers took a flume, took an excursion all the way down to the wood yards in West Carson City, up there at the Ash Canyon, Kings Canyon mouth. December 15th, they had the first regular passing train leaving the Yellow Jacket dump. What a wonderful place to get on a train if you're a woman in a skirt. And that would go down at 8 a.m. and come back about 4 p.m. There was no definite return time in the newspaper. Okay, December 20th was the first newspaper advertisement where anybody knew what the railroad was doing officially. It left Gold Hill at 8:15 and got to Carson, as I said, at or about by 4, departed then. The Gold Hill passenger depot was completed January 5th, and they had a new schedule then. The train left Carson at 8 o'clock and then left Gold Hill at or about 4 p.m., so they reversed the schedule. Now in the morning, you could come up from Carson and go down in the afternoon. January 28th was the first passenger train to the Virginia City depot area, and February 1st, 1870 was the first newspaper advertisement of schedules. I'm not going to talk about this very much. Virginia City notice left on the 3/4 hour. That's because Gold Hill was really the dispatch point for going down here, not Virginia City. Later on in 1870, all the trackage between Virginia City and Gold Hill was dispatched by a local dispatcher, not by the Carson dispatcher. Freight trains left Virginia daily at these hours, and they left Carson at the very same hour. 2-hour transit, the trains were scheduled to meet at Mount House and Pass. It cost you 25 cents to ride the train from Virginia to Gold Hill, and $2 to go all the way down to beautiful Carson City. The way it worked out, Carson would run 3 trains a day. Virginia would run 3 trains in the opposite direction on the same schedule. The Story would wind up pulling 1 train, the passenger train that left at 9 and arrived at Virginia, and either the line or the Armsby would pull the freight train, which left Virginia and arrived at Carson. Yeah, it is the opposite train. And of course, these locomotive assignments changed depending on whether the locomotive was in service or out of service. But that's a typical arrangement. August 19th, there was a new timetable now. We had 2 combination cars, so they could run 2 passenger trains.